What is wrong with us? Wasn't the First World War brutal enough? Why, after just 2 decades, did the world plunge into a Second World War? A war that would claim over 70 million lives, cause direct economic losses of a staggering $70 trillion, and lead to the persecution of 6 million Jews. It was a rupture in the course of human civilization. Even today, you can trace nearly all of our modern geopolitics and international relations back to that single catastrophe. So what could have possibly triggered such an unbelievably devastating war all over again? What really happened after World War I? After all, the outbreak of a war can never be explained by a single event. When it comes down to it, it takes a combination of many factors to finally light the fuse. In 1919, as the First World War ended, one of the most hated documents in history, the Treaty of Versailles, was officially signed. Many people argue that it was this very treaty that directly triggered the start of the Second World War in 1939. Specifically, Article 231. It stipulated that Germany had to accept total responsibility for all the loss and damage in the war. Because of this, it became known as the War Guilt Clause. The message was crystal clear. No matter which other countries were involved, Germany had to bear 100% of the blame. The victors, particularly France and Britain, were determined to get their compensation from Germany. The Treaty of Versailles, in effect, became a product of the victors' conflicting self-interests, and it shoved the defeated nations into an abyss. In the end, Germany was ordered to pay the Allied powers reparations of $33 billion. In today's money, that's equivalent to about $270 billion. The amount was simply unimaginable. It wasn't until 2010 that Germany finally paid the last installment. It took them nearly 100 years. You might be wondering, where was this money supposed to come from? The war had already left Germany in ruins. The nation was completely incapable of covering the cost. Its people were starving. With no other options, the government resorted to printing money just to stay afloat. But the consequences soon became brutally clear. After Germany made its first major reparations payment in 1921, the country plunged into hyperinflation. It got so bad that the government literally couldn't print money fast enough to keep up with how quickly the currency was losing its value. To put it in perspective, in Berlin in 1922, a loaf of bread cost about 160 marks. By the next year, you couldn't even buy a single loaf of bread for 200 billion marks. The currency's value had plummeted by a factor of over $1 billion. People were hauling cash in wheelbarrows just to buy groceries. The first thing workers did after their shift was sprint to the stores. Because if you waited just 1 hour, the prices would double. If you didn't get there in time, you had no choice but to go home and haul back another sack of worthless cash. Obviously, Germany was in a full-blown economic crisis. Unemployment skyrocketed. People wandered the streets, filled with fear, anxiety, and a sense of complete helplessness. And it was into this chaos that Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party stepped onto the world stage. He made a simple, powerful promise: to put milk and bread on every German family's table. With fiery, inflammatory speeches, he channeled the public's rage, directing it squarely at the architects of the Versailles Treaty. You have to admit, he was a masterful young political operator. He knew exactly how to manipulate the masses. In 1923, as public faith in the German government hit rock bottom, the Nazi Party deliberately staged a coup to overthrow it. But Hitler was still green and lacked the power he needed. The putsch was a failure. But in a strange twist, the failed coup only boosted Hitler's public profile, making him more popular than ever. In reality, Hitler now understood a crucial lesson: taking power directly through violence wasn't going to work. This forced him to change his strategy. From that moment on, elections and political infiltration became his new path to power. In just 8 years, he went from being the leader of a fringe political party to the Chancellor of Germany. He was a gifted orator who would meticulously practice his gestures and poses in front of a mirror. On the campaign trail, he was a chameleon, constantly shifting his ideology to fit the audience. Hitler and his Nazi regime used every tool at their disposal to seize control: systematic propaganda and brainwashing, violent suppression of dissent, the dismantling of democratic institutions, and the creation of a powerful cult of personality. This is how they gradually subjugated the population and built their dictatorship. Hitler had a theory: whoever can conquer the street can also conquer the masses. And whoever can conquer the masses can conquer the state. Putting these methods into practice, the years that followed were flooded with disinformation. The press was forcibly bought out or shut down, and hate speech became commonplace. As for how Hitler managed to brainwash millions of people into becoming his blind followers, how he became the world's most infamous dictator, and what specific techniques and strategies he used that were so powerful they even forced Albert Einstein into exile. I'll cover all of that in a detailed future video. Meanwhile, in the late 1920s, the United States was riding high. Boosted by its role in World War I, it had cashed in on selling weapons and munitions, fueling an economic boom. Public optimism was soaring, and massive amounts of investment poured into the stock market. But beneath the surface, a global crisis was about to explode. Then, in October 1929, it happened. The US stock market crashed. Overnight, the fortunes of millions of people were completely wiped out. 9,000 banks closed their doors. Factories followed suit, shutting down one by one. 15 million workers lost their jobs. And it was far from over. This capitalist catastrophe didn't just devastate the United States, its shockwaves hit Great Britain, France, Germany, Japan, and countries all across the globe. The Great Depression had gone global. By 1933, 6 million people were out of work in Germany. Many were homeless, yet prices for basic goods remained stubbornly high. Hitler, however, seized the moment. He executed a four-step playbook. First, use elections to pave the way. Second, neutralize the rule of law. Third, crush opposition with violence. And fourth, saturate the public with propaganda. With this strategy, he transformed Germany from a democratic republic into a fascist, totalitarian state, setting the final conditions for the outbreak of World War II. After securing total control of the country, Hitler began working to realize his dream of a new German empire. He was deeply influenced by the theory of Lebensraum, or living space. He envisioned a racially pure nation inhabited only by the Aryan race. A nation where Jews and Slavic peoples had no right to exist. To fill the public with hatred for these groups, the Nazi Party demonized Jewish people, framing them as a sinister force controlling international finance, buying up the media, and orchestrating global conspiracies. They pushed the narrative that Jewish people were the sole cause of Germany's defeat in the war and its subsequent economic collapse. Through relentless propaganda, these lies took deep root in the public consciousness, paving the way for the purges that would follow. But this was nowhere near the end of Hitler's ambitions. His goals went far beyond that. Then in 1935, the unthinkable happened. Germany established an air force. For a defeated nation, this was strictly forbidden. But Hitler didn't care. He openly violated the Treaty of Versailles. However, in that period of international turmoil, other nations were too preoccupied with their own problems to react decisively. Their responses to Germany's rearmament were mixed. Great Britain, for its part, adopted a policy of appeasement, essentially letting Germany do as it pleased. In fact, many in Britain felt that the Treaty of Versailles had been deeply unfair to Germany. They believed the reparations demanded were astronomical, crippling the German economy, and that stripping Germany of its military rights was simply going too far. Britain was also worried that cracking down too hard might just fuel Germany's desire for revenge. So, in June 1935, Britain signed the Anglo-German Naval Agreement. The idea was to ease tensions and maintain the balance of power in Europe by strategically loosening some of the military restrictions on Germany. What they didn't anticipate was that this gave Germany a green light to build up its own independent navy. But as Nazi Germany became more and more militarized, France felt deeply threatened. On its eastern border, the French were forced to construct a 450-kilometer-long line of fortifications, the Maginot Line, in an attempt to defend against a potential German invasion. At the same time, Hitler was pushing for economic recovery through a policy of aggressive rearmament. Germany's unemployment rate dropped significantly. Industrial output returned to 1929 levels, and the GDP grew at an average of 10% per year. The Nazis trumpeted this recovery as an economic miracle. But this prosperity had a dark foundation. It was built on militarism, racism, and theft. The wealth of Jewish citizens was stolen, and they were herded into concentration camps to be used as slave labor. Fueled by nationalism, a thirst for revenge, and his own dictatorial ambition, Hitler began his quest to establish a new world order. His eyes turned first to his neighbor, Austria. His grand vision was to create a Greater German Reich, a massive empire with Germany at its heart, uniting all German-speaking nations. His ultimate goal wasn't just to conquer as many nations as possible to satisfy his ego. It was a strategic move to seize resources needed to fuel his country's growth. And so, the prelude to the Second World War quietly began. In February 1938, Hitler summoned the Austrian Chancellor, Kurt Schuschnigg, threatening an immediate military invasion. Hitler forced Schuschnigg to sign an agreement. The deal effectively gave Hitler the power to allow his Nazi party to infiltrate and operate freely within Austria. To infiltrate the Austrian government, Dr. Hans Fischbach, a loyal follower of Hitler, became the new finance minister. One of his first acts was to release a huge number of imprisoned Nazi party members. In less than a month, the situation in Austria had spiraled completely out of control. Chancellor Schuschnigg knew that if he wanted to stop the takeover, his only option was to rally the public and defend the nation's sovereignty. He decided to call for a national referendum on Austrian independence. He never could have predicted the result. The move absolutely infuriated Hitler. The day before the scheduled vote, German troops were massed on the outskirts of Vienna. War was imminent. To prevent bloodshed, Chancellor Schuschnigg had no choice but to resign. Hitler immediately invented a lie, claiming that riots had broken out in Vienna, and used it as a pretext to send in troops, supposedly to help maintain order. The very next day, the Austrian parliament was dissolved. The country's sovereignty was gone. A key reason the invasion, known as the Anschluss, was so successful was the power of Nazi propaganda. A segment of the Austrian population, captivated by Nazi ideology, truly believed that Hitler could lead them to become a superpower. They willingly gave up their own sovereignty to join him. After annexing Austria, Hitler set his sights on his next target, Czechoslovakia. His justification was simple. The Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia was home to about 3 million ethnic Germans. This is where British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain entered the picture. He wanted to avoid war at all costs and naively believed that if he just gave Hitler what he wanted, Hitler would be satisfied and war could be averted. And so, despite mounting opposition, the Munich Agreement was signed in September 1938. The Sudetenland was sacrificed as a pawn for peace in our time. And while the immediate crisis had been resolved, it was only the beginning. The annexation of the Sudetenland didn't satisfy the Nazis, it only fueled their ambition. A new crisis was just around the corner. And just as some had feared, less than a year later, Hitler sent his army to invade the rest of Czechoslovakia. Although the people fought back bravely, the German army won an easy victory. The country was then split in two. One part was absorbed into German territory, while the other became a Nazi client state. Slovakia was now nothing more than a puppet government. For this, Prime Minister Chamberlain faced severe criticism back in Britain. Soon after, Winston Churchill made a grim and accurate prediction. Hitler was going to attack Poland next. And war was now unavoidable. To secure Poland, Hitler made a cunning move. He signed a secret non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. This was shocking, given his hatred of Soviet ideology. But he had one simple reason: to clear the path for his invasion of Poland. At the same time, the The Soviets also had their own designs on Polish territory. Driven by this shared interest, the two powers came to a quiet understanding. With everything in place, on September 1, 1939, nearly 1 million German soldiers began their advance into Poland. Their plan was to attack from the north and south simultaneously. The move stunned the world. For Britain and France, the policy of appeasement was officially dead. Their fantasy of trading territory for peace was shattered. How would the world respond? As events unfolded, they understood the old saying, if your neighbor's house is on fire, your own is at risk. The time for compromise was over. Britain issued a final ultimatum to Hitler: if the invasion of Poland continued, they would declare war on Germany. Tragically, Hitler ignored the ultimatum, left with no other choice. Great Britain formally declared war on Germany. Soon after, France, Australia, and New Zealand followed suit. South Africa and Canada also declared war on Germany. Prime Minister Chamberlain announced the news to the world over the radio. And while the history books mark this as the official start of World War II, in some ways, the real war hadn't truly begun. Yes, technically, these countries were now at war with Germany. But not a single one of them sent military support to Poland. Poland's army at the time was tragically outdated, still relying on horse-mounted cavalry. It was completely unmodernized and stood no chance against Germany's tanks and artillery. Still trapped in the mindset of appeasement, Britain and France were never in a position to save them. Although Poland mobilized nearly 1.3 million men, they were crushed under the German army's torrent of steel. Their defensive lines were broken in 7 days. Within 27 days, they had completely surrendered. The swift victory hugely inflated Hitler's already massive ego. But Germany's ability to conquer Poland so quickly came down to one thing: Hitler's blitzkrieg. This military strategy, meaning lightning war, emphasized speed and surprise. It involved rapid attacks with tanks to break through enemy lines before they could react, immediately followed by coordinated air support. It was a strategic doctrine of winning swift, decisive victories to fuel the war effort, and Hitler used it to end the battle in record time. At the same time, to maintain the relentless pace of the blitzkrieg, Germany resorted to unconventional methods. They supplied their soldiers with a drug called Pervitin. This methamphetamine allowed soldiers to fight without fatigue or the need for sleep. It suppressed hunger and thirst, dulled pain, and gave its users a surge of confidence. As it turned out, drugging their soldiers was incredibly effective, while extremely harmful to their long-term health. In the short term, it was a major asset in winning the war. Fueled by the drug, German soldiers could fight day and night, completing their objectives in impossibly short amounts of time. The blitzkrieg, therefore, wasn't just a product of military technology. It was a perfect reflection of Nazi Germany's ruthless, domineering ambition. And Poland was its first victim. What was even more tragic was that Poland wasn't just invaded by Hitler. The Soviet Union also came in to get their piece of the pie. The defeated nation was carved in two, with one half going to Nazi Germany and the other to the Soviet Union. The Soviets' justification was simple: before the Russian Revolution, they argued, this land was actually part of Russia, so they were simply taking back what was rightfully theirs. And there was another country in a similar position, a nation that had also been part of the Russian Empire before 1917. That nation was Finland. Stalin was worried that Finland would fall into German hands, because he knew he couldn't really trust Hitler. The biggest problem was that Leningrad, one of the Soviet Union's most important cities, was only 50 kilometers from the Finnish border. If Finland were ever occupied by Nazi Germany, they would be far too close to home for Stalin's comfort. So, before Hitler could even react, the Soviet Union demanded that Finland hand over a portion of its territory. Unsurprisingly, Finland refused. In response, the Soviets launched a full-scale military invasion. Now, you'd expect this to be over quickly. The Soviets had a much larger army and far superior equipment. But the war dragged on for over 2 months, with the Soviets making very little progress, a stark contrast to the German blitzkrieg. By the time the war finally ended, Moscow had managed to take only about 11% of Finland's territory. And only after a bitter fight. But what the Soviets didn't realize was that Hitler's attention wasn't actually on Finland at all. His eyes were on Norway and Denmark. In April 1940, Hitler drew up his plans. Using the same blitzkrieg strategy, he launched an invasion of both Norway and Denmark. This invasion didn't last long, either. The countries were too small to stand a chance against the German war machine. The Norwegian government fled to London, where they established a government in exile. British Prime Minister Chamberlain had to finally admit his failure. He had been unable to protect numerous neighboring countries from Nazi invasion. And so, on May 10, 1940, he resigned as Prime Minister. Immediately following his departure, the controversial but resolute Winston Churchill took his place. On that very same day, Hitler launched his offensive against France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. This was the beginning of all-out war in the West. It was clear to everyone that Hitler's ambitions were spiraling. The French army dug in along the Maginot Line, while Allied forces took up positions on the borders of Belgium and Luxembourg. A massive battle was about to erupt. Hitler, once again, relied on his signature blitzkrieg strategy. Over 1,000 fighter bombers and an army of roughly 3 million ground troops launched the German offensive. This was the start of the famous Battle of France. The German army was split into 3 groups. Army Groups A, B and C. Army Group B would attack the Netherlands and Belgium, luring the main Allied forces north. Army Group C would stage a diversionary attack on the Maginot Line to pin the French forces there. Meanwhile, the main armored force, Army Group A, would cut through the Ardennes forest, a natural barrier the Allies considered impassable, and strike deep into the heart of France. French military experts were convinced that a large army could never pass through the forest. The terrain was too dense, the roads too rugged, but they were wrong. Army Group A forced more than 40,000 military vehicles through the Ardennes. 5 days after the invasion began, British forces fighting in Belgium were stunned to find a massive German force attacking them from behind. The soldiers were now surrounded on 3 sides by the Nazi army. They had only one escape route left, the sea. The port of Dunkirk became their only hope. Whether they could be successfully evacuated would become a pivotal moment in the history of the Second World War. Nearly 400,000 Allied soldiers were now trapped on the beaches of Dunkirk. Rescuing them in time was absolutely critical, because the Nazi army was closing in on them with terrifying speed. They had no other choice. If the evacuation failed, those 400,000 soldiers would likely be annihilated. For Britain and France, it would be a catastrophic loss, one that could cost them the war and even their nations forever. At this critical juncture, Churchill put a plan into motion. On May 26, 1940, the mass evacuation, codenamed Operation Dynamo, officially began. It would become the largest military evacuation in history. As the operation unfolded, German ground forces closed in, while their aircraft strafed the beaches from above. The scene on the sand was horrific. The port of Dunkirk itself was severely damaged by German air raids, making it impossible for large ships to dock. The Allies were forced to load troops directly from the beaches, but hampered by bad weather and relentless German air attacks. Only 76,000 men were evacuated in the first 3 days. The situation was on the brink of collapse. Then, on the verge of disaster, the British government urgently requisitioned a flotilla of over 850 civilian vessels. This fleet of little ships, crewed by the Royal Navy and even private citizens on their own fishing boats, sailed day and night between Dover and Dunkirk to assist in the evacuation. In the midst of the chaos, soldiers helped each other, desperately trying to survive. By the time the operation ended on June 4, nearly 350,000 soldiers had been successfully rescued. Around 50,000 troops, unable to fight back, were lost, but the success came at a cost. The vast majority of the Allied army's heavy military equipment had to be abandoned and was completely lost during the retreat. During this time, Italy, under the rule of the dictator Mussolini, joined Hitler's Axis powers. On June 10, the two nations declared war on France and Great Britain. A few days later, France surrendered to Hitler. By July of 1940, Hitler was in control of nearly all of his neighbors: Austria, Poland, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and now France. At that moment, Germany was the master of Europe. Both Britain and the Soviet Union were now players in this war. But Germany and the Soviet Union had signed a peace pact, so Hitler wasn't worried. He was confident the Soviets wouldn't attack him. In effect, Great Britain now stood as the only nation still fighting against Germany. So the question is, what role was the United States playing in all of this? The same America that had made a fortune off of World War I? Had it recovered from the Great Depression? And why was it sitting on the sidelines? It seemed obvious that if the war had stopped right then and there, Hitler would have been the undisputed victor. So how did the tide of the war eventually turn? And how could Great Britain possibly defeat the German war machine?